Hello class, this is my responses to some of the questions at the end of chapters 18 and 19 that dealt with trends in incarceration as well as race, ethnicity, and the criminal justice system. So the first question from chapter 18 that I selected to answer is a question about what best explains the rise in incarceration. And well, what appears to have occurred, according to everything I've read, is that it does have something to do with the war on drugs. But ironically, arrests for drug offenses, that's not the main driver, at least not at the state level. You can make an argument at the federal level, certainly, with 50% of all inmates there for some drug offense. But what was happening, as we've discussed before, is there was a rapid rise in violent crime starting in the 1970s, really the late 1960s, then on to the 70s, through all the way to the early 1990s. And drugs, rightly or wrongly, were blamed for this rise. And there's some evidence to suggest they did have an aggravating influence on rates of violent crime in neighborhoods that were already at high risk of violent crime or that were just had high violent crime rates. And so then in response, you had more aggressive policing and prosecution of violent offenders that explains much of this boom in incarceration that we saw throughout this period. When we get into the 1990s, though, as we've talked about previously, and incarceration rates remained high even though rates of violence dropped, that has something more to do with the behavior of prosecutors. And so we've talked about that before, and there was a debate on prosecutors having too much power. But the rise in violence, you want to just cut away everything else I said, just the rise in violent crime best explains the rise in incarceration rates. Well, the question 2 asked about what to do about prison overcrowding. And thankfully, in some states, this problem's already taken care of itself because more are now considering community corrections. That is, more state authorities are considering community corrections in lieu of incarceration. And if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that there has been a drop in the percent of people in prison. These are between the years of 2017, 2018. Things probably haven't changed too radically since then, but there has been a drop in some states, but in some other states there has been a rise. So some places as far flung as the Deep South out west, and some places closer to Pennsylvania, there has been an increase, but Pennsylvania itself has experienced a decrease. California, in total numbers of inmates, has actually seen the largest absolute decrease, but it's not the biggest percentage change shown here. So there has been this de-incarceration movement sweeping the country, but it's not even. We have to keep that in mind, that there are numerous different criminal justice systems, and they don't all move in lockstep with one another. That is sometimes confused with the fact that we have one federal system. So we want to keep the variation in mind, because it does vary from not only from state to state, but from county to county as well. The fourth question I thought was worth addressing, just because of there's a definitional issue here. So it asked about prisoners receiving better public services than the urban poor, and I put poor in quotations because the answer to this question hinges entirely on what we are including in the poor. And so if the poor means homeless people, well then yes, being incarcerated would provide relatively more public support. But most poor people are not homeless, and so it's pretty sketchy then at that point if you're talking about people who are making less than $25,000 a year, whether or not they would be better off in prison. I don't think so. Okay, so chapter 19 then deals specifically with the issues of race, ethnicity, in the criminal justice system. And the first question is one that always draws a lot of controversy. Why are people of color, in quotations there, overrepresented in the criminal justice system? So first of all, what we have to recognize is that when we say terms like people of color, who exactly are we talking about? Well, it's pretty clear the way the term is used. We're talking about, for sure, blacks or African Americans, and to a lesser extent, Hispanics. It doesn't really make sense, though, if we include anybody who is non-white, Asians, for instance. Because, yes, blacks, and to a lesser extent, Hispanics are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, whereas Asians are underrepresented relative to their proportions in the populations. Asians, East Asians in particular, so people from South Korea, China, and Japan, have lower crime rates than whites, so they have the lowest crime rates overall. Look at the homicide trends by race on the right-hand side. You can see that far and away the highest homicide rates are among black non-Hispanics, and then you have Hispanics just a little bit above whites there in the chart. And so what explains this overrepresentation? Well, first and foremost, it's violent crime rates. That's what explains a lot of the black-white difference. Higher crime rates among blacks is going to translate into higher incarceration rates, higher involvement in the criminal justice system. Then there are other issues that are no doubt important, but probably not as important as just the crime rates themselves. One being no money to pay bail or mount a good legal defense. And so if African Americans on average are earning less income, they have less wealth, then the chances that they are going to be able to make bail and mount a good legal defense is quickly diminished. And then finally, there is some sentencing disparities for drug charges, which you could chalk up to racism maybe in some cases. But what we have, especially at the federal level, and this was reformed a few years back in the Obama administration, was a pretty large disparity in the sentences given out for people convicted of crack compared to people convicted of some cocaine-related charge. So even if they had the same amount, the crack defendant would be sentenced much more severely, at least at the federal level. And this is also true to some extent at the state level. But we know that among cocaine users, if you're black and a cocaine user, you're more likely to use the crack or rocked up form than the powdered form. Okay, so that's some of it, but most of it really deals with differences in violent crime rates. And so finally then, question 5 is basically, how do we reduce racial differences in punishment? Well, the number one thing you have to do is reduce racial differences in crime rates. Okay, so this is a really tough nut to crack because it's not exactly easy to change rates of crime across the board for entire groups defined by their race. And so, of course, there's lots of variation within any racial group. But from the criminal justice perspective, one of our best bets for reducing crime rates is not necessarily more incarceration. That does have some deterrent effect, but what we know works much better in terms of deterrence is just more and better policing in high crime areas. You get much more bang for your buck for each additional officer hired than what you do with longer prison sentences. So you want to have a greater number of officers focusing on the most likely offenders, and this is sometimes referred to as focused deterrence, and this has a proven capacity to reduce crime rates in some very dangerous neighborhoods. And so that, while it may be a simple answer, that is the thing that is probably the most promising. We know how to do this. It's a concept that has been proven to work in places like Boston and other cities where focused deterrent practices. So not only do you hire more officers, but you get them to focus on the most likely offenders. So very different from a zero tolerance policy where you're just net widening and arresting just any old person that you are able to bust for any old offense. That you go after those that are likely, first and foremost, the ones that are likely to shoot at one another. And you know who these guys are. They are profligate sinners, and so they have long rap sheets. And so you tell them, look, we're going to make a special project out of you, and if you are involved in a crime, you are going to get arrested. The certainty goes way up, and the severity goes up on their punishment. Okay, that is all for now. Until next time, bye-bye.